Coming into the season last year, I'd venture to guess that the expectations for most fans of the Indiana Pacers weren't all that high. They were coming off of a season in which they barely finished with the winning record and were swept out of the first round of the playoffs by the Cleveland Cavaliers, although they did only lose those 4 games by a combined 16 points. The problem was that was all with All-NBA wing Paul George on the roster, a player that had since been traded away as was requested, and the guys they got in return, Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis, weren't seen as fair compensation at the time. But after getting off to a rough 6-8 start through mid-November, the team figured it out under second-year head coach Nate McMillan, and finished with a record 6 games better than they had the previous year, good enough for 5th place in the Eastern Conference playoffs, led mostly by the sudden emergence of Oladipo as an all-star and eventual All-NBA selection. In the playoffs, they came out swinging in the first round once again against the Cavaliers, but fell just short in a thrilling 7-game series marked by more than a few questionable calls on both sides that arguably could have swung multiple games in either direction. With that Cavs team going on to represent the Eastern Conference in the NBA Finals, there have been a lot of discussions about what could have been for last year's Pacers team, as well as what could happen this season, with LeBron now in the West. They made some moves in the offseason to try and improve, but what concerns might they still have on the roster, and what should the expectations be this year? Let's go ahead and get started with the 2018-19 season preview for the Indiana Pacers. One of the more surprising moves Indiana made early in the offseason was declining the player option on Lance Stephenson's contract for next season to open up some more space to sign other players. It made sense on paper, especially with the team reportedly interested in throwing a big offer sheet at restricted free agent Aaron Gordon. But with Stephenson being a solid contributor on a cheap deal, I question whether or not it would be worth it to let him go. The first thing they did with their cap space was bring in wing Doug McDermott on a 3-year, $22 million deal. This one was honestly a bit confusing to me, simply because of how aggressive Indiana was in going after a guy that, yes, has shot the ball well from 3 so far in his career, but has already been traded 3 times, and will be on the 5th team of his about-to-be 5-year career in Indiana next season. I understand the need, as the Pacers were a top 10 team in 3-point percentage a year ago, but shot them at one of the lowest frequencies in the league. So getting a guy like McDermott to be a high-volume 3-point shooter and provide the offense with much more spacing around Victor Oladipo makes sense. But if his defense doesn't improve from his previous stints, he will be a liability on that end. I would have liked to see the team go after more of a 2-way contributor with this kind of money, mostly because I'm not sure who they were bidding against to offer a deal worth more than $7 million a year to McDermott, considering the limited cap space available this summer. But like I said, I can understand what they were thinking from a spacing standpoint at least. The next move they made was signing wing Tyreke Evans to a 1-year, $12 million deal. With Stephenson leaving, the team was desperate for some perimeter playmaking outside of Victor Oladipo, and that's exactly what they got with Evans. He had a career year last season in Memphis with great numbers across the board, most notably improving his 3-point percentage and attempts to levels we hadn't previously seen from him. He continued to post strong assist numbers as well, showing positional and skill set flexibility that has been consistent throughout his career, but is probably an even better fit for the modern NBA than the way the game was played when he first entered the league at the beginning of the decade. He brings good size as well, and his versatility should allow him to fit right into pretty much any lineup Nate McMillan wants to put on the floor. The most interesting of which would be bigger lineups with both him and Oladipo in the backcourt at the same time, surrounded by wings and bigs. Having another capable ball handler and playmaker that can also space the floor off the ball is something the team simply didn't have a year ago, as Stephenson struggled shooting from 3, and Darren Collison isn't on the same level as a scorer and playmaker as Evans. All things considered, this is a great signing by Indiana, as Evans was a pretty hot commodity on the free agency market after his success with the Grizzlies, and there's little risk in the 1-year contract. The only issue I have is Evans' problem staying on the floor the past few years, but if he can stay healthy and away from injuries, he should be a huge asset to the Pacers. The last thing I want to touch on before moving on from the Pacers offseason is the drafting of Aaron Holiday. A 3-year player out of UCLA, he should provide similar contributions to those of the Pacers' incumbent point guard Darren Collison. A reliable off-ball 3-point shooter with some on-ball playmaking ability and feisty defense, Holiday was one of the most NBA-ready guards in the draft, and selecting him to help boost the team's perimeter rotation right away as opposed to taking on more of a later round project makes sense. This also allows the team to potentially let Collison walk as a free agent next summer, with his replacement in Holiday already on the roster. Alright, with the offseason now reviewed, let's move on to a few concerns I have. The only big concern I have for the Pacers next year, apart from where they stand in the East, which I'll get to in the next section, is the simple fact that they don't have enough shooting on the roster to be considered a top-tier team in the East. They have some guys that can shoot it at a high percentage, but volume is going to be an issue. Even with the additions of McDermott and Evans and Holiday, I doubt they're going to put up enough shots from the outside at a high enough percentage to challenge the Celtics and Raptors. Teams from either side of the league just don't make the conference finals without being in the top 10 in the league in three-point attempts in recent years. And even with some improvement in that area, Indiana has a long way to go from last year's team to get there. Not only that, but one of their biggest projected contributors in that area, Doug McDermott, might not even be able to stay on the floor in the postseason with his issues on the defensive end. As a whole, they should be a strong defensive team that plays at a conservative pace and only takes good open looks from three, and relies on Oladipo to create a large amount of the offense, very similar to last year's group. But I don't know that that formula is going to get them as far as their fans hope to go next season in the modern NBA. And despite a strong overall roster, missing out on one of the most critical parts of successful offense in the NBA today is a big concern. Okay, now we get to the tricky part in the section that is the most likely to upset some of you guys. The Pacers were the team I decided to cover this week because there have been a good amount of discussions about their place in the East in the comments section of previous team preview videos. And judging by those conversations, it can be a pretty polarizing topic. I would think that with the roster moves they made and the improvement of some of their young bigs, a reasonable expectation would be a 3rd or 4th seed finish in the East, depending on any injuries to the Celtics, Raptors, or Sixers. They have the talent, continuity, and chemistry to make plenty of noise in the playoffs as well, but expecting them to win more than a series is a bit much, and it would be unrealistic to expect them to advance to the conference finals. For me personally, and this is where some people will likely get mad at me, I still see Indiana as a 2nd-tier team in the East, with a 4th seed finish behind those teams I mentioned previously pretty likely. I do think they're going to win a series in the postseason, and even though anything could happen, they're not an Eastern Conference Finals caliber team in my eyes. I don't have anything against them, and the front office has done a great job of recovering from the Paul George situation and fielding such a good team. But the East is still very talented at the top, even with LeBron James no longer around. The Celtics are the best team in the conference to me, followed by Toronto and Philly. And although each have their own question marks, whether it be injuries or youth, I see each of them as simply more talented than the Pacers. Each of those teams have multiple All-Stars on the roster and good depth around them. And while Oladipo was great last year and the Pacers have plenty of good depth to go around, can they really be considered one of the top 2 or 3 teams in their conference when their 2nd best player on the roster is probably Tyreke Evans? No disrespect intended to him, but he isn't an all-star caliber player for them. And although they do have some young pieces like Sabonis and Miles Turner that could have breakout years, I just don't see either of them becoming the kind of players they need them to be next season to compete with the best in the East. Again, I don't have anything against the Pacers, and I do like their team, but just because they lost in 7 games to the team that won the East in last year's playoffs doesn't just automatically make them a threat to win the conference this year, even with some questionable calls that could have swung the series their way. I am excited to see this Indiana team grow and develop the next few years for sure, and they'll be getting a good amount of League Pass viewership from me next season as well. But even though I do expect them to win their first playoff series without Paul George on the roster since the 04-05 season, that's about as far as I see them getting in the postseason. And there you have it, my 2018-19 season preview for the Indiana Pacers. Really quickly, and I put this at the end of the video so as not to take up any time at the start, I want to address some changes you'll see in my content moving forward. Basically, I've been having a ton of issues with copyright claims on my recent videos as a result of the use of NBA video in my content. I'm not going to go fully in depth on this, but there is a link in the description to a video I put on Twitter yesterday that explains it a bit better. I just want to let you guys know that the format will be a bit different moving forward. I'll use face cam, graphics, and pictures the way I have today, but I just can't use NBA video in my content anymore. If you have any feedback on how to improve the videos I make in this new format, please let me know down in the comments section below. If you missed any of my previous Monday, Wednesday, Friday videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.